subject of science through some example coming from the biomedical field. I'm not going to reread Elizabeth's biography, which is very complete on the site, but just give you a free reminders and a summary of my discussion with her in preparation for this presentation. After a PhD in microbiology at the Utrecht University, Netherlands, she immigrates to the United States 20 years ago to work in a laboratory at Stanford University, a lab pioneer in microbiomes of humans and marine mammals researches. I encourage you to ask a question about our research on dolphins used as sniffer dogs. Fascinating. After 15 years in the lab and an experience of being plagiarized, she started working on the subject of plagiarism and scientific integrity in general, and discovered that she had a real talent for it. What I retained from our discussion, Elizabeth, and I quote, "Plagiarism is bad for the scientists, but not bad for the science." Thanks to explain that to us. It's your turn. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was wonderful. And let me share my screen. It's the awkward going in between. There's my screen. And that should look good. Yeah, so after my career in sampling dolphins, I guess, I switched to science integrity. And so I am currently a consultant. I'm not employed. And I screen the scientific literature for all kinds of problems. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But before I go into my talk, I will disclose some of the ways I make a living, because I have a lot of trolls on Twitter who follow me and who are always asking me, how do you make your living? Are you paid by the pharmaceutical industry? And so I'm not paid by the pharmaceutical industry, but I will offer consulting for science integrity and occasionally microbiome analytics, which is my previous job. And so I work mainly for universities and scientific publishers. I will occasionally get speakers honoraria to give seminars. My name is on 4 patents. I worked at uBiome, which is a company that got raided by the FBI, and the founders are currently being charged with fraud. I had nothing to do with that, but I have 4 patents, and I don't think they're worth a lot of money, but there they are. And I do have a Patreon account, which is where people can donate $1 or $10 or whatever you can miss to support my work. So those are my sources of income. I also would like to thank a lot of people who are doing similar work as I do, who are critical of scientific papers after they have been published, and who provide the platforms to raise these concerns. So I want to specifically mention PopPeer, which is a website where I will discuss scientific papers, and I'll talk about that later in my talk. But most of these people are doing similar work as I do, but maybe a little bit less visible. They might work under a pseudonym, or they might do the work combined with their normal work, so they don't really have a lot of time. But these are all people who are very passionate about science papers and who want to correct them. And so why do we care about science papers? Why do we look at science papers and find errors? We do that because we care about science, because science builds upon science. So every science paper is used by other science papers to as a building block or as a starting point for new research. So every scientist will look at the literature and we'll see a lot of papers that have been published and will base their work upon that. So I see science as a brick wall onto which every generation of scientists layers another layer of bricks. So if one of those bricks, one of those publications contains either an error or scientific fraud, can be both, that means that other people will waste a lot of time trying to replicate those results. If that brick contains an error or fraud, the other bricks on top of that are not on stable ground, and the wall might tumble down, or at least part of a wall. Now, most scientists are honest and hardworking. I don't want to say that all scientists are fraudulent. That's really not the case. I'm really focusing on a very small fraction of scientists that might be fraudulent. But science as a field also is not immune to fraud. I think a lot of scientists are sometimes thinking that everybody's super honest and that you can believe all the results. And that's also not the case. So there is fraud in science, like there is fraud in many other places. Now, fraud is a big word, and not all the problems that I'm finding in a paper are fraud. It's a slippery slope from making an error, as we all do, to maybe being a little bit biased, or picking a particular result that gives the best output, maybe leaving out outliers, but it is a slippery slope on towards real fraud. And in the United States, we have the Office of Research Integrity, ORI, and that oversees misconduct, which is funded for research that has been funded by the National Institutes of Health. And they define science misconduct as one of three things: plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication. So plagiarism is where a person steals somebody else's words or ideas and passes that off as their own. And I don't think that's the worst offense of these three, because it's still science. It's not bad for science. It doesn't bring in any false ideas, but it's of course very bad for the scientists who originally did that. We should contribute each other. We should credit each other for the work that we've done. And then falsification and fabrication, I think, in my opinion, are even worse. So falsification is where a person does an experiment, but leaves out a particular result, an outlier that doesn't fit in the hypothesis or doesn't fit in the beautiful curve, or when they change the values that they have measured. For example, they increase a couple of values, a couple of data points to pass a threshold or to just fall under a threshold. So basically, yeah, the results are there, but they're not, the researcher didn't like them and will change them a little bit. So fabrication then is where a person completely makes up results. So there was no experiment done. A person just types in a couple of numbers in a spreadsheet and passes that off as science results. So those are the three definitions, the three things that fall under the definition of science misconduct in the United States, at least. But there are other things that you can think of, and I'll mention a couple later in my talk, that you can also consider to be science misconduct. So there can be all kinds of problems in scientific papers. I listed a couple. So not all of these are misconduct, but there are problems in scientific papers that could lead to other people trying to replicate those results, but not succeeding in that. So I've listed a couple. I mean, this list is not complete, but just a couple that I have come across. So you can have study setup problems. For example, you can have a study in which the control and the treatment group are not the same. And of course, they should be the same in every respect, like the same age, the same gender distribution, the same health status, except for whether or not they're being treated. So there can be problems with that. There can be misinterpretation of results, where a person just failed to think of another possibility to explain the results they've measured. There can be all kinds of errors in statistics, calculations. I've also seen papers with really, really tiny error bars where you just know that's not how biology works. Like you would not expect every measurement to be exactly the same. There's an undisclosed conflict of interest. For example, a person might have a patent or company stock and not mention that, and say that a particular product from their company is wonderful, but fails to mention that they have a financial advantage of publishing that. And it's not necessarily wrong to have a conflict of interest, but it's wrong to not disclose it, to not tell about that. And then there can be all kinds of problems with animal ethics or human subject ethics. For example, there can be a lack of approval, or the study has started before the approval has been obtained. Or there can be photos of very large tumors in animals, which are not allowed. Papers can have excessive self-citations, where half of the papers that have been cited are from the authors themselves. That's also not a very good thing. Plagiarism, I've mentioned, concerns about the peer review process. And the part that I'm focusing on is duplicated or altered photographic images. So that is my specialty. I find those, and I'll tell more about that in the following slides. So there's a range of problems that you can come across even by looking at a paper that has already been peer reviewed and published, because peer reviewers might miss certain things, might be biased, might be short on time, and it's usually only 2 or 3 people who peer review a paper. Well, once a paper has been published, there's many more eyes on it, and problems might arise or might be found even after the paper has been published. And in my opinion, after a paper has been published, it's not a solid block of truth. We can still criticize it and we can still discuss it. This is how science should be. So there have been many cases of science misconduct that have been discussed widely in the news. I've listed here 4 cases just to show that science misconduct can happen anywhere in the world and in any science field. I don't think that any particular science field is more or less prone for fraud. That probably happens everywhere. So these 4 cases are Andrew Wakefield, Jan-Hendrik Schön, Haruko Obokata, and Diederik Stapel. So Andrew Wakefield is a doctor who claimed that vaccines caused autism, but his Lancet paper turned out to contain a lot of falsified data. He described 12 patients, but he changed some of the dates to make it look like these children had autism-like symptoms after they had been vaccinated, while in reality, some of them had already these symptoms before the vaccination. But still, even after his paper got retracted after a long fight, a lot of people believe that certain vaccines cause autism, and this is still a very widely believed concept, even though this paper was science misconduct. And this paper is probably the one that got the most influence and is still being believed, and so has done a lot of damage, in my opinion, because a lot of children have not been vaccinated based on this paper, and might have, even some people might have died of measles, for example, preventable diseases. In physics, there was the case of Jan-Hendrik Schön. He worked in the USA, he worked on semiconductors. He fabricated his result, he made up results, and is up to 28 retractions. And then Haruko Obokata in Japan worked on stem cells or stem-like cells, and has 2 retractions. And in the Netherlands, we have the case of Diederik Stapel, who worked in psychology and who also fabricated his result. He is up to 58 retractions, and that was, I am from the Netherlands, so this was a big shockwave in research in the Netherlands, that a person could just make up 58 studies and probably even more. So science misconduct can happen everywhere. I've not been involved in these cases, but what I specialize in is looking at images such as the ones you're seeing right now. So most scientific papers do not have photos. They might have line graphs or just text or tables or things like that. But in the biomedical literature, in particular parts of particular fields, you might see photos like these of gels, of blots, of tissues, of cells. And if you look at these photos, they might all look similar to each other. They might all look, black with green cells, or they might all look like black stripes on a background. But if you look at them carefully, you can see that each of these bands and each of these panels is different from the other. They're all unique, and you can tell them apart. So all these photos are fine, nothing wrong with them. But I specialize in finding duplications. And so here are a couple of photos that I found throughout my searches that of images that have big problems. And I sort of have a couple of different examples to show you the different types of problems I might see in these photographic images. So I'm looking for duplications. So basically the same photo being used twice to represent two different experiments. That's an inappropriate. If it's appropriate, I would not flag it. But in all these cases, there are different experiments being shown that, but the same photo. And if we start at the top left, you'll see a bunch of panels that all look unique, but you'll see that two of them, which I've marked here with red boxes, those photos are identical. And here are two other photos, another pair marked by me in blue, that are also identical. So there's a lot of photos here, a lot of panels. Each of these panels represents a different strain or a different experiment. I removed the labels, but they should all look different, but they're not. And so this is what I call a simple duplication. It's the same exact photo being used twice, but representing different experiments. Now, this could just be an honest error. The author might just have mislabeled their photos, or they might be a little bit sloppy and they just by accident inserted the same photo twice. That can happen. So this is not necessarily misconduct. This could just be an error. If we look at these two photos here, there's also a duplicated photo, but it's shifted a little bit. There could either be a rotation or a mirroring, things like that. If we look at this example where we see 4 different photos, each of cells being treated with a different amount of radiation, you can see that the 0 and 2 gray panels overlap. If you focus, for example, on this group of cells here, you might see that here as well. So it's the same photo, but it's zoomed out and it's shifted under the microscope a little bit. These are cells. And the same here, the 2 gray and the 8 gray photos also appear to show the same cells. So again, there is a shift under the microscope of the specimen, and also a distortion of the photo a little bit. It's not, here it's more a rectangle and here it's more a square. And this is what I call a repositioned duplication. So it's not just a simple photo, there is a shift or a turn or rotation or mirroring. Same is going on here in this example at the bottom right, where you see 2 Western blots, that 2 protein blots that overlap with each other, but they're shifted 2 lanes, but they're representing 2 different cellular locations and 2 different proteins. And so that is not good. Again, there's a shift of the photo. So these are repositioned duplications. And then on the bottom left, I have an example of what I call an alteration in the duplication. So it's a duplication basically within the same photo. You see 4 different panels, and panel A will have, you can see that lane 1 and lane 3 appear to look identical. And in panel D, we see that lanes 2, 3, and 4 appear to look identical. So here we're looking at a photo in which within the same photo, you'll see the same element twice or even 3 times. It could also be a photo of cells where you see the same cells showing up multiple times. That's very unexpected. And this is basically photoshopping, I think, but very unlikely to have happened by error. So this is very likely done with the intention to mislead the reader. So this appears to be done intentionally, while the simple duplication appeared to be done by error. And so this classification of photos helps me a little bit to know which papers might have been containing problems by error or by misconduct. It is very hard for me to tell it for an individual paper because I don't know, maybe you don't really know what happened. So I will just usually flag the duplications and leave it up to the editors-in-chief of the journals to figure out what happened. But I did do this as a strange hobby, and I turned this into a science project by scanning 20,000 papers. And a lot of people believe that that is not possible, but I'm only looking at the images. I'm not reading the papers. So it's much faster than you might think. So I scanned 20,000 papers by eye, and I found a lot of duplications. I made sure to include different types of journals, 40 different journals, but they're all in the biomedical literature. They're all on cancer research, microbiology, which is my own field, etc. I made sure to include 14 different publishers. And I found in this set of 20,000, 800 papers to contain these duplicated images. So that's 4% of these papers that I scanned. I have to also point out, I only scanned papers that had at least one photo. If they only had tables or line graphs, I didn't count them. So this is really focusing on papers with photographic images. And so 4% of these contained inappropriately duplicated images. And I showed you the 3 different types. So since they were, we sort of made an estimate that the simple types were usually done by error, and the altered ones were done intentionally. So we sort of made the best guess we could that about half of the papers that I found, so 2% of all papers that I scanned, contained photos with intentionally duplicated images. There was so much rotation or alteration going on that was hard to believe to be done by honest error. Now, does that mean that, can you extrapolate that to all scientific papers? Is 2% of all papers misconduct? Does it contain fraud or misconduct, at least in images? That's hard to say. It might be even higher because I could only look at photos, and it's relatively easy to spot these duplications in photos. But if you think of tables and line graphs, how easy would it be for a person to change the results in the lab and then publish it without me or anybody else noticing that? That would be much easier. And so I think that the real percentage of fraud is much higher than 2%. It might be in the 5 to 10% range. And that's a scary number because as a researcher, you probably will come across a couple of these papers. If it's in the 5% range, that's a very high number. And it's much harder to detect. So I usually play a game on Twitter called Image Forensics, where I'll post an image and people can spot and see if they have the talent to spot these overlapping images. And it works really well in a conference room, but it doesn't really work well on Zoom. So I'll just show this image and then I'll show you the duplication. So you might come across an image like this in a scientific paper and look, oh yeah, there's lots of different treatments and lots of different protein stainings. And so all these photos should look unique. There should not be an overlap. They're all different. But yet, if you look carefully, you might see that a lot of them show overlapping parts. And so this is how I've labeled this paper. And this paper I reported in February 2015 to the journal, and it got retracted a couple of months later, which I think is a good outcome. I think there's so many errors in this photo, or it was done intentionally, I don't know, but it's so many that I would not trust any data from this lab. They're either super sloppy or they're fraudulent. But it's I would not base my research based on these results. So here's another example. These are 4 different treated leukemia cells that were treated with 4 different treatments. Each of these photos should look unique. It's not a time series or so. And yet, if you look carefully and focus, for example, on these 3 cells, you might see them here in treatment C as well. And if you look at this group of cells with the red and the 2 yellow cells, you might see it here as well in mirror image. And so this is how I've labeled this photo. There's lots of repeating elements, and this appears to be done intentionally. This paper I reported to the journal, but is still out there, is not being retracted. And that's frustrating because I think there's a big problem here, and the editor did not respond to my comments. Here's another example. These are protein gels and blots. And you might, if you look carefully at this image, you might notice this little scratch here. And you can see that here as well. And if you then sort of squint your eyes a little bit, you might see that these 2 lanes look exactly the same as these 2 lanes. And you can see them here one more time. So there's actually 3 occurrences of the same lanes. And I've marked it as here with these red boxes. And this is a remarkable paper because this got published in Science. Science is one of the top journals. This paper got cited 830 times. 830 other researchers based their research on this paper. And I reported it to the journal, and I felt very scary because, I was a researcher, and you basically send a letter to Science, which is the top journal that we all hope to publish in one day. And then they didn't respond. So this paper is still uncorrected, unretracted. It has a huge problem, cited a lot of times, very popular paper, and the journal did not act. They did not retract, they did not correct, they did nothing. It's still out there. And that's frustrating because I did it the professional way, and why didn't the journal not respond? So how do you report these things? So I report them normally to the editor-in-chief of the journal, but you can also contact the research integrity officer of your university. So here's an example. For example, I gave this talk at the University of Rochester, and you can write to the integrity officer of that university, say, oh, I found a paper with a problem. But what is most important is to remain objective. So I will not say, or try not to say, because sometimes that is hard. I will say figure 2A looks remarkably similar to figure 4B, or these two lanes look very similar to each other. But I will not say, make any accusations. I will not say, this is intentionally done, this is fraud, this paper should be retracted. I will not say that. I will only say, these things look remarkably similar. And there can also be all kinds of other problems like conflicts of interest and ethical issues that I mentioned previously. But just try to remain objective and write to the editor-in-chief of the journal. And so hopefully that editor or that research integrity officer will start an investigation. And you can imagine that that will take some time because they need to contact the authors. The authors need to reply back. Maybe they don't reply. Maybe their email address doesn't work anymore because this paper is 5 years old and they have moved to a different university. Or maybe the authors will all point fingers at each other saying, like, it's usually the senior person who says, no, it was the junior person. I have nothing to do with this paper. My name is on it, but I'm not responsible. It's somebody else. As we call in the United States, that is throwing somebody under the bus, basically blaming somebody else for a problem. So these things can take a while. I would not expect the papers to be retracted or corrected in a week or a month, but I've waited 5 years. So most of the papers that I found in my initial scan of 20,000 papers, so those 800 papers I've reported in 2015 to the editor. So we're 5-6 years later, and I know what happened to these papers. So only 28% have been corrected. That could be a good outcome. 10% have been retracted. That's a good outcome in case of really big problems. But 60% of papers have not been acted upon. So the majority of the papers have not been corrected or retracted. The editor just did not want to take any action. So that is frustrating because I try to, discreetly send an email and get this fixed. But the editors have seem to be either very busy or overwhelmed or do not want to handle these cases. So I'm taking things a little bit more to the public space because I feel it's not in the interest of the reader to not correct these things. The reader has no idea that there might be a big problem with this paper. And why are these things not brought in the open? So I post most of my findings nowadays on a website called pubpeer.com. And pubpeer is a website where you can leave comments on one particular paper. So every paper, it goes by the unique identifier of that paper. So every paper has most papers have a DOI, a unique identifier. And so you can leave your comments on a paper on the website. If you also install a plugin that will work with one of your browsers or even with the citation manager Zotero, that means that during your literature searches, you can see which papers have had a pubpeer comment. And it works really well. So you'll do your PubMed search, you'll see a lot of different papers and you'll see, oh, this paper has a pubpeer comment. Let's see what other people had to say about it. Now, most of the pubpeer comments are these types of image problems that I've showed you previously, but there can be all kinds of other things like ethical issues or conflicts of interest. And that works really well. So I've posted around 4,000 papers by now on pubpeer. And occasionally I will talk about these things on Twitter. So my handle is Microbiome Digest. And so the science paper I showed you in the previous slide I have discussed on Twitter, because I think that's not good. I will usually not say which particular paper it is. I don't find that that I should really blame people, but I'll show the problem. So I'll usually remove some of the identifiers and not say which paper, just show the problem. And in this case, I did say which journal it was. And here's another example where I found problems in a paper published in Nature by Harvard scientists. So that was pretty high, and they had big problems. And this paper got retracted. So this paper got a little bit better handled, in my opinion. So I've talked about all kinds of problems. There's many different problems that you could see in scientific literature. So it's there's many other types of problems. There can be problems with peer review, where people peer review their own papers. There can be fake affiliations, where people claim to work at a particular institution which doesn't exist. And so these are all potential misconduct, because it means that that there's not an objective way of analyzing their results or obtaining ethical approval for their research. So there's many of these people who make up their own institution. I will point out there's this person who has made up the California South University, which does not exist, but has set up a complete website that looks very real, but it's all stolen text and images from other websites of university. And it's actually amazing how much work this person has put in setting up a completely fake affiliation. There are predatory publishers, which are journals and publishers that sort of make misuse of the open access model. They offer very fast peer review, and you might get, as a researcher, you might get these emails saying, "Dear esteemed researcher, we would love you to publish in our journal." And you might think that's a real journal. But by the time you've published your paper, you will then maybe notice that this journal is not really accessible if you do your normal literature searches. Nobody will find your paper. It will live in a dark corner of the internet and nobody will see it. And then it's hard to get it retracted and published in a real journal. So these journals have all kinds of problems, but it's also very hard sometimes to distinguish a real journal from a predatory, because there's a lot of gray zone in between. Some people actually make misuse or deliberately publish in these predatory journals because they cannot get their paper published in a real journal, because the peer review would say, oh, this is not a good paper. But these predatory publishers will publish anything as long as you pay them. And so some lone authors with wild ideas, like the California South University guy that I mentioned in the previous slide, they will deliberately publish in these journals and publish one paper after another. But they're really very low quality journals usually. And then there's a particular problem called paper mills, which I've also worked on in combination with some of the group people I've mentioned in one of my first slides. Those a lot of anonymous accounts on Twitter who are doing similar work as I do. So I want to credit them. So there's a specific incentive in China. If you are a medical doctor and you're done with your medical school and you want to work at a hospital, there's a requirement that you have to publish a scientific paper. And that sounds sort of easy, but scientific research is actually hard to do. And you cannot really do it sort of if you already have a full-time job, and especially if you're a doctor and you have like a 60 or 90-hour work week, you cannot really do research on the side. But yet these people have to publish a paper, and they're in an impossible situation. So there are companies that offer them authorship on a paper, and so they have to pay a pretty large sum of money, and then they'll have to but then they can get their name on a paper. So these papers are not real. We believe they're completely fake, but they're written with a template. So there's people, ghostwriters, who write these papers, and they change the text every time a little bit. They change gastric cancer to prostate cancer, and now you have a new paper. Or they change some of the graphs. So they probably work with writers and designers who sort of make these new fake papers, all based on a template, and they have very similar title structures. And so as an example, here are two different papers from So these are two different papers, left and right, published by different groups of authors. And they look different, like these doesn't look like plagiarism, doesn't look like duplication or so. But if you really zoom in carefully and you look at this particular photo here and this particular photo here and compare them next to each other, so here you have from the left paper and the right paper, they still look different at first glance, but if you look even more carefully, you might see here, this is a wound, this is a scratch assay, and you might see this letter, it almost looks like a letter J, and you can see that here as well, but it's upside down. So this is the same photo, it's rotated, but it's being used to represent two different experiments. So this paper mill, as we call it, this group of papers, had 125 papers, and they're currently being retracted because the photos are real, but they're probably just, they were an original experiment, but they're being reused to represent all kinds of different experiments in 125 papers. Here's another example where you see a lot of different plots and see duplicated areas. So these plots all look very similar to each other. They're a little bit different, they have different labels. They're from 4 different papers, but they appear to be all the same plot. And then here's another example where you have unexpected findings. This is a paper on prostate cancer, but it lists equally, like even more females than males, which is very unexpected. You would not expect half of your prostate cancer patients to be female. So it appears that this is a template table in which, the studio forgot to adapt one little thing. So they make errors, and this is how you can recognize these journals and these papers. But it's very hard sometimes, because if this is gastric cancer, you would totally believe this table. And then, of course, we've had a pandemic, and the COVID-19 pandemic brought along an enormous amount of papers. So there's just an explosion of papers. There's like 16,000 preprints on medRxiv. And many of these papers have been published in a, to be honest, we've been in a panic situation as scientists in the past year. There's a new pandemic, people were dying. What do we do? Which vaccines might work? Which drugs might work? Which is the best treatment? And there have been just an explosion of papers on this topic. Most of these are opinion or editorial pieces, and they're hastily written, especially in the first half year, the first 6 months of 2020. Lots of retractions have already happened because some of these papers are just fraudulent or contain huge errors. And it seems that a lot of scientists wanted to have at least one COVID-19 papers, and so a lot of bad things happened. There was just not a good quality control. Normally, good science happens very slowly, and I think everybody was just trying to move too fast, which is understandable, but it also erodes, so damages the trust of the public in scientific papers. So a very specific example of a paper that I've criticized is a paper that had a huge effect on the way that COVID-19 patients have been treated. So this paper was published by a professor in a Marseille lab, who we probably are all familiar with. And this paper got actually tweeted in the United States by our president, Donald Trump. I think this is the first and the last time that he tweeted about a science paper, which was remarkable. And he says, "Oh, this paper is going to be a game changer. This is a wonderful hydroxychloroquine is going to be the answer to everything." And so I took a look at this paper, and it's a very small paper. It had a small group of patients, and so some were treated with were not treated, and some were treated with hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, which is an antibiotic, and those 6 patients did really well. So based on 6 patients, this paper got published, and a lot of countries suddenly switched to hydroxychloroquine. And so can you make big changes in science just based on a very small group of patients? Well, maybe if it was a good paper, yes, but I think this particular paper had a lot of problems. the study appears to have been started before the ethical approval was obtained. If you look at all the dates that are listed in the paper, there were differences between the control group and the treatment groups. For example, they were in different hospitals, had different age distributions, different types of PCR tests, and the patients, most importantly, were not randomized. It appears they were handpicked and put in one group or another group, which is not how good science works, because maybe you could make all kinds of decisions, and maybe your control group is then different than your treatment group. And then 6 patients were actually left out of the study. So 6 patients who were started on hydroxychloroquine, 1 of them died, 3 of them got really bad and went to the ICU. But they were left out of the study. And you cannot just say, oh, let's just leave out the undesired patients or the undesired results, and now my results look much better. Of course, that's not really how science should work. So this is in my opinion, leaving out results you don't want, and that's not good. The peer review was done in 24 hours, and the editor-in-chief of the journal was also an author on the paper. So that looks like the peer review was not really done independently and objectively. So I wrote a papier criticism, and I also wrote a blog post about this. Of course, the senior author was not very happy with it. I also found many other papers of that group to have problems with image duplication, with ethical approval. And so I was very critical of this person and found several other problems in this lab. But then there was also the other side of the discussion. So this first paper was saying that hydroxychloroquine worked really well. And I wasn't anti-hydroxychloroquine. I was just thinking that this was not a very good paper. But then there was another paper that came out in The Lancet that claimed that hydroxychloroquine did not work at all, and it was actually very damaging for patients. So that paper was not based on just 6 patients or a very small group. It appears to have looked at 96,000 patients. So that was a huge paper. And the data was collected and distributed by a company called Surgisphere. Now, at some point, it turned out that this data set was not, was maybe only partial real or completely fraudulent. That I'm not quite sure what happened in the background, but suddenly this paper got retracted because people started to notice that some of the numbers of all these different hospitals didn't make up, and that nobody from these hospitals had actually given this data to this person who claimed to have this data set. So if this data was made up or not, I'm not quite sure about, but the paper got retracted. So there was definitely a big problem with it. But the senior author, the person who claimed to have gotten the data, if you look at his PhD work, which I did, I found that his PhD work had this beautiful image. And these are inner ear structures of rodents, although they look like Melba toast. But there's lots of duplicated parts in these images. So it looks like this person is not a stranger to maybe making up data. Unfortunately, this paper, I reported it, but the institution, the university and the journal do not seem to find that this is a big problem. And so this paper is not being retracted. It's still out there, but it has a big problem, in my opinion. So there was, in my opinion, there were bad things happening on both sides of the equation, whether or not hydroxychloroquine works. Both papers appear to have big problems. And then, of course, because of the concerns are raised on these papers, the senior author from Marseille is now starting a legal threat against me, and several others are also starting legal threats against me. So I feel I'm raising concerns about papers, but I'm now facing legal action. And so it seems that the scientific discussion is no longer happening in the scientific arena, but is moving to the legal arena. So I'm being threatened with several lawsuits by raising what I feel are legitimate concerns about papers. And so this is, I guess, the world we live in, that as scientists, we cannot really discuss these things anymore. We're threatened to be silenced. So as a final slide, this is my final slide, I do want to sort of discuss a lot of things that I've discussed before. And these are these are discussion points. I don't have always the answers to these questions. For example, what is the percentage of misconduct in total? This is a question we can probably never answer, because nobody, if you are a fraudster, you're probably not going to admit that you have done fraud. So, but I think it would be between 5 and 10% of papers that contains misconduct. And especially with all these paper mill papers that are being produced right now, which are hard to recognize as an individual paper. I think that in certain fields appear to be completely infiltrated with fake papers. So the percentage of misconduct might be much higher than 10%. Why do people do it? I have different scenarios in my head. Like I can see the person who was very successful in the past and has published in high impact journals, has tasted success, has done interviews. That's all lovely. But once you've done that, it's really hard then if your research maybe then moves to a different topic and is not working as well. The experiments don't work, the results are not there. And suddenly you're not being interviewed, you're not being invited anymore to give a talk. And so these people are maybe addicted to the success they had, and they want to continue that, and they start to make up data, or they start to at least cut corners and not be as accurate anymore as they used to be. But there could also be a person, a junior person who works in a lab where the professor is a bully, where the professor is threatening to fire the employee unless they produce certain results. Like, I want this blot by Friday and I want it to look like this. Well, what do you do in this situation, especially when you're on a visa, where you're dependent on your professor for your letter of recommendation? Then I think you're in a situation where you are tempted to do misconduct. There might be other scenarios, but I'm sympathetic for the sad stories behind the scenes. And I feel that's also the reason I try to not make it about the researchers as much. I try to make it about the research, the papers and the results. Whose role is it to detect misconduct? I'm an unpaid volunteer, I guess. And should journals not be a little bit more scrutinizing papers and a little bit more aware that certain papers might contain fraudulent data? Do we offer any legal protection for whistleblowers? I'm not sure if I'm a whistleblower because I'm not an internal person who has particular information. I just look at published papers, so anybody could see this. Yeah, I try to raise real concerns, but I'm not being protected at all. I don't work for a university, so there's nobody who's going to pay my legal fees except for myself. And so I'm taking a huge risk, personal risk, and huge financial risk for raising these concerns. But I feel as scientists, we should all be supportive. And luckily, I am currently being supported by a lot of scientists there's several petitions supporting my work. And I'm very grateful for that. But in the end, I am in a very risky position. There's all kinds of conflicts of interest. I've discussed that some editors are not really taking any action. And why is that? But in the end, there's also tremendous cost of misconduct, not just for scientists who try to replicate these results, but for science as a whole, because it's so damaging for science to talk about these cases. And it might be easy for the general audience to think that all science is fraudulent, which it's really not. Like, most scientists are hardworking and honest, but it's easy to walk away from my talk and think that all science is flawed. So that's definitely not the case. And I hope that you're happy that there are scientists like me who try to correct the literature and make it better. So if you are on Twitter, I would recommend you follow me, and will play occasionally the game called Image Forensics, where I'll have little puzzles and you can see if you can spot it, and I will hand out an emoji medal to the first person who gets it. And with that, I will stop sharing and take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So fantastic. I was dreaming about that types of topic. You did it. Thank you so much. So
you're very welcome.
Thank you for this really, really interesting session speak. And there is a lot of questions on the chat. Please, we will if the first one, you can take the lead, please, and ask directly your question to Elizabeth, because sometimes on the chat is not really clear. So there is we can begin with Olivier Sandre. Olivier?
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, Elizabeth. Yes, I thank you very much. So my question in the chat was, what is your experience about the response brought by the French or French-speaking universities? There have been cases, we all know this Olivier Voinet case that occurred. That was really annoying, and that shed light on this topic of fraud. Do you think there is a particularity in our university compared to the other one?
Well, first of all, there's fraud everywhere, and there's bad responses all over the world. I have been, I was not involved in the Voinet case myself, but it seemed that sometimes people are just protected by their university, and it's. I'm not sure if the situation in France is very different. People have told me it's very hard to fire a person once they have a university position. And so that might be a problem where if there's real fraud or misconduct or anything, like how easy is it for a university to fire that person and to let them go? So if that's a problem in France, then that's a real problem. Like I feel there should be certain cases where people just cannot longer be protected. But it happens everywhere. There's been many situations internationally at the US, in other European countries, where I've been very frustrated with the response of the university. So it's not particular, I think, a French problem, but I feel in the particular case I'm now involved in with the Marseille lab, like I've written also to the university itself, because I'm being harassed by people from the IHU Méditerranée. I'm being personally harassed, and I've written to the university, can you at least, tell this guy to not harass me? And the university did not respond. Like I've wrote to 12 different persons, they none of them responded. And I feel that's a really bad situation where like an international researcher is being harassed by a particular university. At least what the university should do is write me back and not ignore it, because I'm not going to go away. I'm not going to be intimidated by legal cases. So it appears that there's a lot of powerful people and there's a lot of protection, and these are old structures. And I hope with social media and international attention that we can break through these sort of old structures and make it better, because it is really tough to see how little support until now there was from French universities for this particular case. And it's only now that I feel with the international petition that people are starting to support me more publicly, but there seems a lot of intimidation and harassment going on at particular universities. And not only in France, that seems
just to mention in the Raoult case, the case of Professor Costagliola, who is a medical research institute researcher, and she was also suited by the Raoult people, and her organization protected her, gave her this legal protection. So in your case, where also Boris Barbour, who is a researcher from the CNRS, I think the community of researcher, myself, I'm CNRS researcher, we are asking our organization to protect him, like, and you, of course, again, in this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. It's been going on for too long.
Yeah, and I've put the letter. The letter was written by a postdoc, a French postdoc at Monash University, Loni Besançon, you know him?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And any researcher, French or not, can sign it. I gave you the link to everyone.
Thank you for putting the link in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Blondine, how to explain the very long time delay for journals or publishers to the comments? Is it due to the protocol defined by publisher?
There could also be all kinds of problems. I think in several of the cases where I have found, let's say, 40 different problems in a particular journal, I probably overwhelmed the editors because maybe they only had one case a year. And then suddenly there's Elise Big writing them, oh, I found 40 different papers. And they're like, oh, this problem is so big. And it's very human then to not respond to if you get faced with a overwhelming problem. But in other cases, yeah, I think in some cases the journal just did not respond at all. In other cases, they did respond by contacting the authors, but the authors didn't respond. And we all know, like, my email address on some of my papers doesn't work anymore because I don't work at that institution anymore. And so when people move on, especially if they in the ages when we didn't have an ORCID ID, it's hard to find some people. Some people have very common names. Some people have very unique names and are easy to find, but a lot of people have much harder to find names that could be written in different ways. And so it's just harder to find these people. So I think it's a combination of editors who are not really sure what to do, publishers who are not responding, authors who are not responding, and there are guidelines. So there's the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. They have very clear guidelines, which could be even more clear because there's certain things missing, which if a journal belongs to COPE, they should follow those guidelines. But the guidelines are a bit vague. For example, it says contact the author. The author will provide the original materials. But usually the author might not reply, and the original materials are gone. And so then I think people cannot go down the flowchart anymore. They stop, and they sort of so the flowcharts do not really handle these types of cases, which are the most common ones. And so flowcharts should be better. And yeah, it's just a combination of all kinds of factors. And academia is just such a slow-moving thing. It's just not going to change very fast.
So I have to select because we are not so many them. Yes. Do you have from Theodore Leiber? Do you have an idea or of a view of the extent of published bad quality fraudulent papers per scientific discipline?
That's hard to know because I focus on images, and so I will, by definition, focus on papers that have photographic images. So that is all mainly molecular biology, nanobiology, or technology. But I've also come across of particular line graphs, which are very common in chemistry and physics, that can contain duplicated parts. But it's a little bit outside of my field, and it's harder to recognize. So because I focus on photos, I find these papers in papers that have photos. But it's probably happening in any field, but it's much, much harder to detect.
Yeah, thank you. Rob, a question about the sliding scale. Rob?
Yes. Oh, okay, I'm unable to go on video, it seems, for some reason. Okay, starting the video. Yes, I was just wondering because I'm working a bit more on the literature reviews, Elizabeth. So what you find is on the lower end of the spectrum, already that citing of studies is sometimes inaccurate. On the other end of the spectrum is the complete faking of a paper. And in the chat, maybe you have not seen it. I gave an example, by extent one of my own papers on outsourcing that was cited by a doctoral study in the UK as having information, the core of the study, about marketing variables, and the word marketing only appears in the names of journals in the list of references. But this person, because this is how I got hold of it, obviously has his PhD, I assume it is a he, but I don't know, accepted. And that means that that person already goes into the academic world without little penalization for doing something wrong. I mean, I just want to use the words black and white a bit over here. And then I think it's a sliding scale as well. You make a little mistake, you tend to make a bigger mistake. And it reminded me of the, as I thought I was a bit more into literature reviews. I have a big A3 where it shows, with plagiarism. And it is a relatively small written like typeface 8, and there's only one box in the bottom on the right that is green. The rest is all orange and yellow and red because of the many mistakes you can make. So I was just wondering in this sense, if we don't teach it right from the beginning, how are we going to get it right at the end? So
I agree. It's very frustrating to see that these people sort of throughout their career appear to remain fraudulent, and it could have been caught at a much earlier stage, like you said. And yeah, there's just very little punishment for these cases that everybody sort of knows that there's misconduct going on, but everybody seems to look the other way. And I don't have a good answer other than to share your frustration with the lack of punishment, which is a big word, but like there seems to be very little repercussions for these people, and we should do better, because it also tells other young researchers that maybe it's okay to do fraud, and that's not the message we want to send out. We do want to keep science, good and pure. That's maybe
So does open science then help in terms of the open peer reviews, do you think? Which makes it easier to, to at least attach comments in
maybe, yeah. But I think we need to end, right?
Thank you. Sorry, but
I know.
And I have really the last but not the least question, very, very interesting, from Guillaume. I can see a question about retracting fraudulent articles. In the case of articles basing their research on a fraudulent paper, should these articles be retracted or corrected also? Is there a standard procedure? As a fraudulent paper could lead to an exponential number of wrong papers, even without fraudulent intention from the other authors.
Yeah,
very interesting. Thank you.
Good question. I don't think those papers should be retracted, but I think a lot of people might not know that a paper is retracted and might cite it. We all have our favorite papers, and it's hard to know if a paper in the meantime has been retracted. So there are committees, I'm part of one of them, to do better checks if a paper gets at a submission stage, to check all the papers to see if there has been retractions and corrections, and to contact the authors and let them know, like, did you know that you cite your paper, retracted paper? And I don't think those papers should be retracted, but in most cases, we only use a tiny sliver from one paper. And I could see particular cases where the retracted paper will have a huge impact on a paper, but in a list of 50 or so citations, it's maybe only one paper that is really the important one. So I think we should let the authors know, but not retract the papers, because if they were able to replicate their results, then there might be fraud in the first paper, but it might still be valid.
Very complicated. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm the timekeeper. That's not the good position, but we have another session after this. Thank you very, 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 very much, Elizabeth, for these very, very interesting topics. A lot of questions. Perhaps we will invite you next time for a next conference in order to follow this discussion, which is really actual and in each country. Thank you for being so numerous, and have a good conference. Elizabeth, see you, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. Bye-bye from California.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Alors à tous, ne partez pas tous trop nombreux puisque nous avons notre dernière table ronde qui va commencer d'ici quelques minutes. Notre dernière table ronde du Forum de l'innovation de 2021, donc de 16h30 à 18h. Donc restez en ligne. Pour une question importante, est-ce que la responsabilité sociale, est-ce que l'université responsable est compatible avec la loi du marché? Alors à tout de suite, juste pour une petite pause, mais restez avec nous. Yes, this is the same address. You just have to stay on this link for the roundtable too. The same link. Bon, on va boire quand même un tout petit coup. Hein. On commence à 30, hein, de toute façon. Hein, Sophie? So, good afternoon. We are very pleased to welcome you to the last roundtable of the conference. In fact, Innovation Forum 2021 on the topic is the responsible university adapted to the law of the market. So I think our presentators are now here. You can open your camera if you like. Daniele Archibugi, Henry Etkovitz, Jean-Alain Hérault, et Dimitri Usunidis. We are pleased to welcome you this afternoon for this roundtable. I think Daniele Archibugi, I think he was here.
Hello.
Hello.
Nadine, I'm here.
Okay, I can see you. That's the reason why. All right. Thank you. So, and Henry Etkovitz, I think he will join us very soon, hopefully.
I think that he has some problem for this connection.
Connecting, okay. So, but I think we will begin because, and then he will join us. So, since last Monday, with the Innovation Day of the Research Network on Innovation, and during the Forum Innovation that began on Tuesday, we have tried to define the meaning of the responsible university. Regarding first, the reason why we should associate the term responsibility with the one of university, and second, regarding the forms, the actions of the responsible universities, one important aspect that was stressed by many speakers is the growing relationship, the growing links between university and the society, between university and the market. To briefly describe the law of the market, we can recall two famous sentences, that of Karl Marx in the volume 1 of Capital, when he wrote, accumulate, accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets, and that of Milton Friedman in 1970, when he wrote quite provocatively, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. So the question raised in the roundtable is the following: is the responsible university adapted to the law of the market? So my first question will be for Dimitri Usunidis, but I will just, before that, just come back to the presentation of our speakers. So we have with us this evening, thank you very much, Daniele Archibugi, who is a professor of economics at Siena in Italy, and who is also an honorary member of the Research Network of Innovation. It's important to underline this point. Also, we have Jean-Alain Hérault, who is professor of economics at the University of Strasbourg in France. And we have Dimitri Usunidis, professor of economics, and also honorary president of the Research Network of Innovation, and is from the University of Littoral. So my first question will be for Dimitri Usunidis, how to explain, in fact, this link with university and responsibility, and this link with university and market. What are the factors that explain this marketization of research? This is my first question to you. You have about 10 minutes to answer it. If you want, you can share your slide, or I can do it as you want.
Okay, thank you very much, Miss President. I will try to speak in French for our French-speaking public. But I have a short PowerPoint. Tu peux partager?
Ok, je partage.
Okay, this is my PowerPoint. Donc, so, in my mind, I think, je pense que l'innovation actuellement, l'innovation émerge et se diffuse dans et à partir des, comment on appelle ça, des écosystèmes d'innovation. Premier constat, des écosystèmes d'innovation qui sont bien établis soit au niveau régional, soit au niveau national, soit au niveau mondial. Et nous avons constaté pendant toute cette conférence qui a un grand succès, que l'université joue un rôle primordial. C'est un acteur clé de du fonctionnement adéquat de ces écosystèmes d'innovation, même d'innovation majeure. Ce constat fait, c'est-à-dire écosystème d'innovation, premier mot-clé, deuxième mot-clé, c'est l'université. Et cette combinaison, cette osmose entre université et écosystème d'innovation a été entreprise il y a quelques décennies, depuis toujours, mais disons explicitement depuis 3 décennies, dans le monde industriel, et par des politiques, avant on appelait ça les politiques industrielles, maintenant on les appelle des politiques industrielles et de l'innovation. Alors, ces politiques industrielles de l'innovation ont 2 volets. D'une part, selon moi, c'est faciliter le transfert de la recherche publique vers le privé, c'est-à-dire vers les entreprises, d'un côté, et de l'autre côté, créer un contexte qui est propice à ce transfert de connaissances, à ce transfert d'innovation même, en herbe, vers les entreprises. Ce contexte est un contexte ouvert. Là, si on prend le PowerPoint, la politique de la concurrence actuelle, passée depuis quelques décennies, est axée sur l'ouverture des marchés, c'est-à-dire l'ouverture à la concurrence. Ce contexte, donc, qui a rendu l'économie beaucoup plus flexible, beaucoup plus agile, beaucoup plus fluide, etc., a permis les contacts entre les universités et les entreprises, mais aussi la fusion des travaux universitaires avec les prérogatives, mais aussi avec le fonctionnement même des entreprises. Alors ça, c'est les 2 constats. Maintenant, cette stratégie, ces politiques de l'innovation qui mettent l'accent sur le transfert du public vers le privé a elle-même 4 volets qui, disons, qui vont favoriser la coopération, la constitution des réseaux d'innovation au sein desquels les universités jouent un rôle important. Alors, ces 4 volets sont, premièrement, la contractualisation. Maintenant, la recherche publique, la recherche universitaire, pas uniquement universitaire, il y a 2 gros pôles de recherche publique qui étaient, disons, qui tenaient l'État entre ses mains. Il y a d'abord l'université, de l'autre côté, c'est le militaire. Alors, si on se concentre à l'université, mais aussi au militaire, il y a 4 volets qui propulsent cette coopération publique-privée. D'abord, c'est la contractualisation. De plus en plus, les universités, pour trouver des financements, font appel aux entreprises. Et l'État, disons, se retire petit à petit pour laisser place à une recherche au service des premiers financeurs, qui sont les entreprises. C'est la contractualisation qui s'applique au financement de la recherche universitaire. Deuxième volet, c'est la valorisation, la création, pardon, des instituts de valorisation de la recherche des universités. C'est logique pour trouver des financements, pour pouvoir exécuter des travaux de recherche assez importants. Les universités sont de plus en plus amenées à se tourner vers les entreprises et par conséquent, au sein des universités, on a ce qu'on appelle la constitution de pôles d'excellence qui vont aider les chercheurs, les laboratoires de recherche ou les chercheurs particuliers d'aller trouver de l'argent à l'extérieur, c'est-à-dire auprès des entreprises. Troisième volet, c'est la modification ou la multiplication, comment on peut dire ça, ou la flexibilisation des statuts des chercheurs. Il y a une certaine fragmentation de ces statuts entre les statutaires, c'est-à-dire les personnels plus ou moins stables, et ensuite il y a beaucoup de précaires, des jeunes qui sortent, qui ont fait des études de haut niveau et qui vont signer des contrats à court ou moyen terme, etc. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a une fragmentation des statuts et des chercheurs eux-mêmes. Comme ça, cette politique permet aussi la mobilité des chercheurs du privé vers le public, du public vers le privé, etc. C'est-à-dire qu'on a une certaine, disons, l'État, par les politiques de l'innovation, cherche à fluidifier le marché du travail des chercheurs pour pouvoir, et des ingénieurs bien sûr, pour pouvoir favoriser l'émergence de ces, solidifier les écosystèmes d'innovation. Un quatrième volet de la politique industrielle et de l'innovation, c'est la création des institutions de financement par le système bancaire, bien sûr, ou par l'État lui-même, qui permettent, à fin de compte, l'émergence de ces innovations par les écosystèmes par conséquent. C'est-à-dire, on voit ça avec le fonds d'investissement qui finance la création des startups, etc. Voilà les 4 volets qui expliquent d'un côté la marchandisation de la recherche. La marchandisation de la recherche ne concerne pas uniquement le rapport entre l'université et les entreprises. Comme je l'ai dit, l'université, en tant qu'organisation, doit aussi appliquer les normes ou les règles du fonctionnement de l'entreprise. Et là, on voit en effet qu'en France, par exemple, l'autonomie des universités, la loi sur l'autonomie des universités vise à transformer les universités en entreprises. On parle de l'université entrepreneuriale. Entrepreneuriale, non pas au sens création d'entreprise uniquement, mais aussi au sens que l'université doit travailler comme une entreprise, trouver des financements et vendre. Qu'est-ce que l'université peut vendre? Ce qu'elle vend, c'est ses trouvailles, c'est-à-dire les résultats de sa recherche. À partir de là, et avec la présidente, Blandine Lapèche, nous avons réfléchi sur sur un schéma qui présente cette marchandisation de la recherche qui a 4 pôles. On appelle ça le carré organique de la marchandisation de la recherche. D'abord, c'est la réglementation, c'est le management, comme je disais tout de suite là, du secteur public, comment l'université doit travailler comme une entreprise et surtout comment l'université, au niveau de la recherche, peut défendre la propriété intellectuelle relative à la recherche de ces laboratoires. Deuxième pôle, c'est la programmation, c'est-à-dire le planning, c'est-à-dire l'université ou le laboratoire de l'université, il faut descendre plus bas encore, où les chercheurs eux-mêmes doivent proposer des programmes pour trouver des financements. Et par rapport à ça, il y a l'excellence qu'on appelle scientifique et technique, c'est par rapport aux tendances actuelles, aux trajectoires actuelles de la recherche dans lesquelles ces programmes s'inscrivent pour favoriser, en fin de compte, la marchandisation, c'est-à-dire marchandisation des résultats de la recherche universitaire. Ensuite, on a la stratégie universitaire elle-même, où on voit avec les institutions de valorisation, avec les conseils d'université, il y a une gouvernance particulière, de plus en plus, disons, ouverte au marché, qui fixe les priorités, les stratégies pour que l'université puisse être attractive auprès des entreprises. Et par rapport à ça, l'université met en place des incitations avec des primes, avec des primes d'excellence ou autres, ou en protégeant la propriété intellectuelle de ces chercheurs, de ces laboratoires d'elles-mêmes. C'est-à-dire que ces incitations vont permettre, venues de l'université, vont permettre de mettre en place ces stratégies pour pour convaincre les entreprises de la puissance de sa recherche. Ensuite, le quatrième pôle de ce carré organique, c'est le contexte économique. Et là, je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, le contexte économique est orienté vers l'ouverture des marchés. D'une part, au niveau de l'offre, il y a la création d'entreprises à partir de l'université, les startups, l'entrepreneuriat scientifique, en particulier, en général plutôt, et ensuite la mobilité des chercheurs. On a dit qu'il y a des programmes communs et les chercheurs peuvent aller du privé au public et du public au privé. Et au niveau de la demande, on a la demande des entreprises qui intervient pour la mise en place de la stratégie universitaire. Donc voilà la marchandisation de la recherche pour conclure est d'une part l'ouverture de l'université vers le monde entrepreneurial, vers le monde industriel, et de l'autre côté, l'intégration à l'université des normes et des règles de fonctionnement en tant qu'entreprise, en tant qu'institution privée. Mais cette tendance à la marchandisation de la recherche a deux déviances, selon moi. D'une part, à force de travailler, à force de mettre en place des stratégies d'attractivité de la recherche universitaire auprès des entreprises, et à force de mettre en place des politiques de l'innovation orientées vers le profit, vers la rentabilité à court terme ou à moyen terme tout au moins, il y a un pan entier de la science, de la recherche scientifique qui est délaissé. De plus en plus, ce qui est délaissé, c'est la science autonome au sens recherche fondamentale, non intéressée. Les génies d'autres temps qui faisaient des expériences à tout va, etc., le concours Lépine, sont de plus en plus rares, sauf si les entreprises elles-mêmes décident, pour des raisons de spéculation scientifique et technique, de financer des recherches farfelues, entre guillemets, des recherches folles. Alors voilà, selon moi, il y a la première limite de cette marchandisation de la recherche, c'est l'épuisement de la recherche, de la science autonome, et de l'autre côté, c'est le renforcement des logiques monopolistiques, au sens non pas tellement le renforcement des entreprises qui détiennent le pouvoir au niveau mondial, mais surtout monopolistique au sens où le potentiel d'innovation se concentre sur certains pôles, sur certains écosystèmes, et qui définissent, à fin de compte, l'avenir de l'innovation. Quand je dis l'avenir de l'innovation, c'est l'application de la science, de la technologie, de la société. Et il y a, par conséquent, les deux sont liés, et cette monopolisation due à la marchandisation peut, disons, exclure du monde de la recherche des projets qui ne sont pas immédiatement rentables. Alors, Donc, la marchandisation est liée à une certaine financiarisation de l'économie en général, et la recherche scientifique s'oriente de plus en plus à la résolution des problèmes de court terme, qui sont des problèmes du monde de l'entreprise, en délaissant disons, les préoccupations ou les problèmes qui peuvent être beaucoup plus globaux, beaucoup plus généraux, beaucoup plus sociaux, beaucoup plus long-termistes, de long terme. Voilà ce que moi je peux répondre à comment je peux définir en 2 mots la marchandisation de la recherche. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je laisse la parole maintenant à Sophie Boutillier, qui doit ouvrir son micro. Non, ça ne marche toujours pas. Il faut que ouais.
It's okay now. Thank you very much for this presentation. So, in fact, according to Dimitri Zianidis, the responsible innovation do not exist. But I would like to ask a question to Henri Escovitch, and can you what is according you how according you the triple hélice concept can be used to study and to support genesis of responsible innovation, and what is according you responsible innovation? It's innovation regarding social or environmental issues. What is your opinion about this question, please? Can you open your camera and your phone, please?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the question of what is responsible innovation?
Mm.
Well, to think of responsible innovation, what immediately comes to mind, of course, is irresponsible innovation.
Mm.
If there is responsible innovation, it could not really be understood without its converse of irresponsible innovation. So what would that be? Irresponsible innovation. It would be new innovations that lead to catastrophic consequences for society and for nature. To my mind, having started research on science, technology, and society from the perspective of the anti-nuclear movement in the United States, the development of nuclear weapons and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy as a cover for that is the epitome of irresponsible innovation. So I must say that if we look at Europe right now, France and its policies, energy policies, are examples of irresponsible innovation, whereas the movement of Germany away from nuclear towards solar energy is an example of responsible innovation. So that's the first criteria. Does it lead potentially to great irreparable harms, to more Chernobyls and 3 Mile Islands? And then, of course, on the other side, does it lead to benefits and not doing harms? So there are technologies, we can judge technologies by these criteria. Of course, it cannot always be known in advance which direction it will go, but we can always have these criteria in mind. And that is the latest effort in the development of the triple helix model. Triple helix of innovation, university, industry, and government. It's balanced by a second triple helix of the public, government, and university as a balance wheel. So we must see the triple helix concept now as triple helix twins.
Mhm.
And so also to understand the triple helix concept, it must be seen that it is fundamentally different from the innovation systems concept. Innovation systems consist of elements and are viewed as systems that are potentially autonomous. The triple helix consists of actors, human beings in institutions that are operating them and could take them in different directions. That is how I found the origins of the entrepreneurial university, the actions of specific actors. Actors who wanted to, in the early 19th century, introduce research into the US university, but there weren't resources. So they had to find the resources. So they were entrepreneurial. And so an entrepreneurial ethos was introduced into the US university in the mid and late 19th century. And it also became the founding principle of universities like Stanford and MIT. And then at a later point in time, the concept was spread more broadly by government policies like the Bayh-Dole Act. So we can see entrepreneurship not as something external to the university, but something that has grown up within the university. That is why when I was studying academics who were forming firms in the 1980s, many would say to me, it doesn't feel very much different in organizing my firm than what I was doing in the university, in organizing my research group. I was searching for resources, I was managing people. Now I'm recruiting funds from venture capitalists instead of from research agencies. I'm recruiting former students instead of new students. But actually, I realize now that what I was doing in the university, I was running the equivalent of a small business within the university. So there's not a great disjuncture between the forms of academia and the forms of industry as are often thought. Of course, there are many different objectives, but there are also some fundamental similarities, especially now as many startup firms that want to hire academics, they adopt academic modes, especially in the biotechnology industry. So these are some of the ideas that I've been working on, some for a long period of time, and the latest ones are applying the triple helix concept as a framework, as a methodology to achieve the UN goals for sustainable innovation. That is the direction that the model can be turned as triple helix twins.
And how can you give more details about the use of the triple helix model to achieve UN sustainable goals?
Okay, well, this were outlined in a paper that I just received word has been accepted in the journal Sustainability. Triple helix twins, a framework for achieving the UN sustainability goals. So if we have these two triple helices working in unison, part of the triple helix concepts were of innovation space, consensus space, and these were thought of as the level of regions, as subregions. But now we raise the level to world regions and look at this as a model for organizing collaborations across world regions to develop sustainable technologies. I first made the proposal in 2000 at the third Triple Helix Conference in Rio de Janeiro, that there should be a collaboration between Brazil and South Africa to develop solar photovoltaics technologies, the new generations of these technologies. We're still at the level of the first generation of slicing wafers. And so these collaborations across world regions, organized on the basis of finding technologies and bringing the resources together across multiple universities in different world regions, governments, and industries. So much larger scale and broader collaborations than simply between a university and a local industry, or a university keeping in touch with its spin-offs. Moving from the region of, in Europe, it's, what is it called? It's in European Union parlance, a region finding its local strength. Here, we're talking about regions that have been developed.
Smart strategy.
Ah, yes, smart specialization, smart specialization. So beyond smart specialization is insightful diversification. Development of clusters based on advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and connecting them across world regions into larger scale projects. That's the scale we need to operate on to address the sustainable goals. So if we started, for example, with a macroscopic technology like solar photovoltaics, the new generations of that technology, with collaborations across world regions, that would have implications not only for the goals having to do with energy, but also of sanitation and food, because the implications for spillover to other areas of traditional technologies are great. So we must go beyond the very modest ambitions of smart specialization to build on existing strengths, to put together large-scale collaborations based on new strengths.
Thank you very much. So in fact, the problem is not only economic. The problem is also politics. So I would like to ask another question to the Jean-Alain Hérault. And what is your opinion about at the European level? What is the role of the European policy to develop responsible innovation regarding social and environmental issues?
Thank you for the question. Blondine, can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes.
So I will first say that I will not specifically concentrate on the European policies, but more generally on the policies of every state, member state. The issue being that we have very different context, histories. The history of the university is definitely not the same in Germany, in the UK, in France, in many countries, and it was something that was said yesterday, and Emmanuel gave us a very interesting historical hint into this topic. Emmanuel Picard, yes. Giving the case of France, but also speaking of, for instance, the Humboldtian model that developed in Germany. I will return to these points. And first, the topic is about valorization policies. Okay, so I just can't pronounce this word in English, probably because it's not so natural. So sometimes I prefer the German, because Valorisierung is very easier. At least it's easier for me to pronounce. But unfortunately, in German, Valorisierung is not so much used, because they have several words. They can, and the most.
Excuse me, Jean-Alain, do you want me to share the screen?
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry, yes, I did not do it, so sorry to interrupt.
No problem. But it will be probably easier, for instance, when I speak and I use German concepts, so you can see it written. Okay. So so I would end up this introduction saying that valorisation, sometimes in French we even say la valo, is something that's very French, and even in some European documents, I read things like valorization is very important, but it seems to be more important for the French than for the other people. Okay, let's come back to this concept of valorisation, because it seems to be, at least in France, one of the bulk of the third mission of universities. And this is the topics of this round table, and even of the whole forum. But we must question this point. To which extent is valorisation the bulk of the third mission? It depends how we consider valorisation. So this word comes from value, but we have many meanings of value. We have economic value, but even in economic value, we have several things. We have questions of exchange value or users value. So valorisation is a way to create value out of the original domain of science. Could be in the technological circle, which is something which is different from the scientific domain, and then through innovation to the market. But valeur is also has many other meanings, and we should concentrate on the other meaning of putting value or creating value out of the scientific activity. It could be creating value through the products of the scientific activity, but not only. Okay, the product of scientific activity is discovery. After discovery, we can have maybe inventions, and then we come to the technological level. And thanks to these inventions, patented or not, we can go to innovation. But the discoveries done in the scientific world can have many other societal applications. And also, it will be one of my final conclusions. Maybe I will return to that. What we learn by practicing science, by doing science, is something that can be learned in a way because there is a specific value in the protocols and the ethic of good scientific behavior. And maybe this could be used in the political circles a bit more, and also in society in general. So returning to the concept of valorization, just to return to this question of linguistics, So you have several words in German. Valorisierung is not very often used. When it is more to adding value to the society, to the culture, to many things like that. When you use the more ordinary wording, Bewertung, you mean to put more economic or possibly social value, added value, okay? And you have even other words like Wertschätzung und so weiter, etc. So, therefore, valorisation should be considered within the context of every national context. Yes, please, the next slide. The last very important question for me is, should we valorize science or research? And it is not the same thing. First, we must start by giving a smart, very easy definition of research. Research is the flow of adding to the existing science. So research is a flow, is an activity. Science is something that's done. And these two parts, these two ideas correspond to very different worlds where the value is not the values are not the same. In the science, in the world of research, what we call in French, la science en train de se faire, science in progress, we have values which is, creativity, dealing with uncertainty, having a lot of controversies, discussing. If we consider the science as something which is done, you have a very high degree of certainty because some consensus has been met. Outside the periods of paradigmatic change, but within periods of regular science, science is very certain in a way. So now the problem is that the society and the administration does not understand very well the difference, which is considerable. And we had a very typical example with the pandemic with the coronavirus, because the population and the government looked for experts to explain how must we understand this new virus and the epidemic, and what can we do? But the problem is that this part of science connected to the coronavirus and also the research on RNA, which is the best and the most interesting solution, are very, very in front on the research front, and therefore we have not la science faite. We are typically in a domain where we will consider science in progress, and in this context, you have no real certainty. So we should think a little more about the interpretation. Considering our topic, when we say, well, what can be the contribution of the university or any other sort of research and institution? What's the contribution? Is it a contribution where you apply science as something that's a stock of knowledge with a lot of consensus, or have we to apply some very new cognitive domains? And this is completely different. We cannot, for instance, if we consider science as something which is done, we can take a researcher and tell him or her, you are an expert, you give your advice. And normally all the scientists will have the same answer to the questions. If the science is not yet done, you take researchers, you ask them, what's your opinion? You have many different opinions. And this is perfectly normal. But people have not been learned of this important difference. Okay. And I want to go to my last, because I guess I have no more time. How much?
1 or 2 minutes.
1 or 2 minutes. So let's concentrate on basic science versus applied science. The bad policy model is the application of the new public management to sort of bureaucratize or planify research. It will push to a reduction of basic research and an increase of applied research, as is if it were an evidence that it is more efficient for the government, for instance, to put more money on applied research because you will get real results, economic or societal. This is a very wrong thinking when you really know something about research and you know how basic research and applied research are completely intertwined. And the most powerful answer to the COVID now is a technology which is very close to the fundamental science. And they won. So, and just one of the very most stupid expression I hear is, we don't want researchers, we want finders. On n'a pas besoin de chercheurs, on veut des trouveurs. I think there is no more stupid expression than this one. Unfortunately, it is in the mind, and sometimes it is said by people in political circles of the administration or at some managers, private managers sometimes. So, to conclude, for me, valorizing science means producing economic or societal value out of scientific results. This is one possibility. We consider science as something which is done, and we try to apply it. Now, there is another interesting question then, is can we valorize research? And research is not the science as something done. It is science in progress. And we should think more seriously of valorizing research. And this is my personal answer to the question, what should be the mission of responsible universities, etc. What should be also the result, the idea, the project of a responsible government? It should be to valorize research, not only science. Because research helps to diffuse values of research, creativity, but creativity with very rigorous protocols, risk acceptance, resilience in case of failure, because in science, in research, we often fail and we try again. And sometimes we cannot find the answer of a question we had, but we find something more interesting than the initial question. This way of thinking is completely out of the ordinary way of thinking of the engineers and of the political circles. But it could be a lesson from the research to the society in general and to the policymakers. Also very, very important, my last sentence, science is a system of organized discussion. It doesn't mean that we have not strong fights, but we are forced to listen to the others. before we fight. And we fight not at persons normally, but we fight about ideas. So this is also, I think, a wonderful lesson that could be given by research to the rest of the society, and the universities could be the ideal place to teach this sort of ethic to the younger people, and also to diffuse through. So the valorization is not a specific expertise grounded on existing science. It is also a sort of exploitation of the ethic of research. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was not exactly my question, but your answer was very, very, very interesting. So now we have another question. So Daniel et Arquebusé.
I take the lead. Well, there is a kind of consensus among you on the necessity to develop responsible innovation. Perhaps the meaning of responsible innovation has still to be discussed, but also there is a consensus on the role of research and the university have to play in meeting this challenge of developing responsible innovation. However, Dimitri Eugénidis and Jean-Alain Hérault consider that, in fact, marketization of research and new public management lead to the reduction of autonomous of basic science, and in fact lead also to the concentration of research on some projects and forgetting new projects, for example. On the contrary, Henry Escovitz considers that the triple helix model and the entrepreneurial university, as we define it, can help reaching the United Nations Sustainable Goals, so that the entrepreneurial university, it's meaning that the entrepreneurial university is able to foster the development of responsible innovation. So now it's up to you, Daniele, to develop your point of view, and perhaps we can focus on the role of European scientific and technological policies to develop these responsible research and innovation. Can we consider that these policies are at the origin of the concentration, or to a better distribution of scientific and technological capacities, and can they help reducing scientific and technological inequalities, perhaps between countries and among countries? The floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Blandine, Sophie, and Dimitri, for this invitation. And I'm happy to share these views. And I would like to discuss something which is what is quite relevant these very days, namely what has happened with what everybody would like to have these days, the vaccine on COVID-19. This is a typical case in which we have really seen in the real world the interconnection between what universities and other public players do on the one hand, and on the other hand, what it happens in the business community. And let me say that we should be quite happy to say that quite a lot of things have been quite good. Why? Because, for example, we have got a vaccine. And this is one of the few times in which the gap between the discovery of the disease and the vaccine has been much faster than in other times in the past. And this has been possible because there was a lot of money funded by the governments into the scientific community, into the business community, but also because at a certain point, there was quite a lot of interaction between universities and the business corporations. And that was vital. Was vital because, you know, while companies were competing among each other, and therefore they were trying to get faster to the target and to gain the market on the one hand. On the other hand, the universities provided some background knowledge which was available to everybody, even when the research was carried out, and therefore they somehow helped to prevent duplications or even allowing duplication, knowing some of the results. But, and actually, the good news is that also there was not one single solution, but against what has happened in the past, we managed to get so far at least 5 different vaccines, and probably within a few months we get 10 different vaccines. And all of you know that when at a certain point there were concerns about one specific vaccine, we at least knew that there were other vaccines available. So that was, I think, a good case in which the knowledge base of universities and the public sector was put into use for everybody. So to go to Henry's question when he said what is responsible and what is irresponsible, of course, there is a negative side. You do not have to do something which is harmful. I totally share Henry's concern about that, but also a problem of priorities. And in the case of COVID-19, it seems to me that the priorities were somehow put into the right place. But this also created quite a lot of problems, because at a certain point, I think that the public sector research, including universities and the government, didn't work quite effectively in other domains. And the first domain was to facilitate production all over Europe and the world, from President Biden to Ursula von der Leyen and all the others, Mario Draghi and others. There have been a lot of discussion about patents, if this patent should be free or if this patent should be proprietary. And I think that the discussion carried out by politicians is wrong. It's wrong not because patents cannot obstacle the story, but because it is not enough to give free patents in order to be able to replicate what we need in terms of vaccines. And there is a lot of tacit knowledge and a lot of knowledge which companies did not write down into the patents, which will imply that these vaccines won't be easily reproduced unless there is a policy of technology transfer, which should be carried out not just by universities and the government, but also by the corporations. And if we go outside Europe or the United States or Japan, or China, we still find out that in other continents, including Latin America, including Africa, and so on, there is not a manufacturing capacity, and therefore we managed to sort out this problem for some parts of the world, but not for others. Again, could have universities have done it better? Because we have seen that corporations and governments acted very much into a national capacity. It is a period in which each government has started to think about its own citizens, to administer vaccines first to their own citizens and then the leftover to the others. But have universities taken their natural role of global responsibility? And I think this has not occurred. And finally, in terms of, since Harry is in the room, in terms of triple helix, I've seen major shortcoming into this process. For example, all the money, public money given to companies have been given to the companies with the wrong contracts, because the good contracts would have implied that the knowledge, not just the patents, but all the knowledge and everything else should have been available to the public players, including universities. And this is not the case. Governments are given a lot of money to the business sector, and they have not got what they should have got in return, namely the knowledge, the blueprints to replicate what was found. And this, again, is a typical case in which universities should have stepped in and somehow managed to provide better advice. So I addressed the issues which were discussed in the room from a specific case study, the case study of COVID-19 vaccines. But it seems to me that a lot of things could have been improved. And so far, the unsung hero of this venture within COVID-19 vaccines, it was carried out by one university, the University of Oxford, which got a collaboration with AstraZeneca. They managed to get a vaccine which might be good, might be better, might be worse, but anyhow, they got something out of that. And they were the only case in which they clearly addressed the social responsibility to distribute the vaccine to everybody. And if you look at the prices, it's not surprising that AstraZeneca is a cheaper one. It might be not a main problem for Europe or for the United States, but definitely it is a problem for Africa and for other developing countries.
Ton micro.
Yes, thank you. That's really great, Daniele. Someone want to react, perhaps Henry or Jean-Alain, Dimitri? Henry, you have to open your micro. Henry. Henry first and then Jean-Alain.
I don't see the question, sorry.
Yes. You can talk, Henry.
Oh, okay. Well, I think Danielle brought an excellent case, which illustrates the need for collaboration across world regions, which we do see some emerging between Brazil has large capacities to produce vaccine. So does India. So there's potential for world region collaborations to solve these problems. But expecting the universities to take the lead by themselves is maybe will wait too long. And so what it needs is the public to become involved and social movements. This is how the environmental movement spread and went into the universities and had effects on business as well. And so we need the triple helix of the public and the university and government. Neither one by themselves will move sufficiently. And so this is the case for an expanded triple helix twins of innovation and sustainability, which we see some elements of it starting to appear in the response to COVID, but we need to go a much longer way. And certainly we need to transcend very conservative concepts like smart specialization, focuses on old technologies, and we must move more expeditiously into new responsible technologies on a global scale.
Okay, Alain, yes?
Yes, just a small remark. So I completely agree with the very interesting speech of Daniele. And I completely agree that focusing on the question of patents is probably just forgiving a large part of the problem. The problem being to have the means to use the science and the technology. And I could also give another example. If you want to make research in basic biology, typically the sort of thing that is applied in the case of the COVID research. You need, for instance, very big instruments, cryo microscopes. These are very, very large things. So this is not for the production of the of the vaccine at the very last stage of this innovation, but the thing that was necessary to get the good knowledge advances to solve, to understand the processes with the virus and to go to the solution. So the scientific equipment is now extremely expensive. To give you an example, cryo microscopes, you have only 4 in France. And you have something like 40 in Germany, and you have 30 in the UK. So the question of financing is important. And in the case of these cryo microscopes, you need, it's the sort of thing you need to understand the spike, the proteins at the spikes of the virus. Once you have bought this thing, you need a whole team that can work with this machine. So all that thing is out of reach of poor countries. Even if they have the money to buy one instrument, they have not the people to run it. You need a team that's working on that for decades, okay? So it's a huge investment in basic science. And if you have not done this investment in basic science, then you cannot exploit it. So, and just a last point, Daniele mentioned that Oxford University was the only university who was able to produce, to have the idea to produce the vaccine, okay, in cooperation with AstraZeneca. But you must, I must stress the fact that this is impossible in a French university because no French university has the money of Oxford. Because Oxford has not some money coming from the government. They have a whole budget of their own because they are landowners for years and years. So it's not a university like another.
Mm-hmm. So the question of how to change universities is really interesting. That's the point of Daniele. Universities should step in, should be more.
Yes, Blandine, you are right. But you don't think that we need crisis to change the evolution of technical progress? For example, we have the example with the COVID-19, but we have the most other example with the war, for example. And after each crisis, we have a new scientific progress, new technological progress, and in fact that we need crisis for the acceleration of technological and scientific progress. You don't think so?
Daniele?
No, you don't think so.
Microphone.
Is that a question for me?
If you want, yes.
Well, you know, I first of all, I appreciate very much what Jean-Alain said. Some universities are richer than others. But let me say that this is not just because some universities have got more better infrastructure and so on. It's also possibly the case that some universities are more proactive of that, you know. And let me say that what really surprised me is to see that companies, corporations, were immediately very eager to look for business opportunities, and they immediately started to lobby with governments and other public agents in order to get the funding. And they managed to get their own industrial researchers and to say, you know what, you stop from tomorrow to do your own research priorities, and you work quickly on finding a COVID-19 vaccine because this is a company priority. Within universities, the situation is often not the same. And if you had to say to your colleagues, you know, now you stop to do what you have planned to do over the last 10 years, and you will divert your attention to do something which is more specific, it's very likely that many of our colleagues won't be prepared to do that. And therefore they won't be prepared to go and work in collaboration with others. And therefore, Sophie, I think that we should recognize that universities provided an enormous fundamental background knowledge. Without this knowledge, we wouldn't have any vaccine today, you know? And therefore, we should not ignore that this has been built in years and years, decades and decades of competence building within universities on which corporations manage to build up and to do what can be the last mile, I don't know, perhaps 2 miles, whatever it is. But we should also recognize that unless universities are properly reformed, they do not work in an emergency. They work much worse than corporations in an emergency. And this, I think, is a problem. And I think we should recognize that the only vaccine so far which is effective, which was generated in public labs, come from the Soviet Union lab, you know, Sputnik. Sputnik was the typical Soviet socialist way to develop it. You lock in a large number of scientists in the middle of nowhere, and you say, I won't unlock you unless you get out with something which I need. It's brutal, but that's the only case I'm aware of which can actually compete with what some business corporations are carried out. So I think this lesson of COVID-19 is indeed a major case in which we need to rethink the overall relationship in between universities, companies, governments, and above all, society.
Yes, thank you. So in fact, university and enterprise don't have the same rationality. But in fact, when there is an important problem for the pandemic today, there is in fact a consensus between scientific and business issue. You don't think so?
So Henry, perhaps also?
Well, first I would like to point out that universities can change on a dime. And historically, we saw that in the United States at the advent of the Second World War, when it was university scientists who proposed the Manhattan Project and sold it to government via industrial interlocutors. And the resources of universities were concentrated at a few sites to work on a half dozen major research projects that had effects and also changed the scale of university research fundamentally going forward. The growth of research centers, collaborations among research groups, the ability to take on large projects. And also, I would say that, quote, poor countries, quote unquote, they are now the ones that have large numbers of trained PhDs, often in US universities, where they make up a good proportion of the faculty. So there's no longer this disjuncture that there was 40 years ago. A lot of the intellectual capacity is in the developing world, and they have learned how to put together resources and concentrate them to have leading edge concentrations of research on a number of topics. You can look at the development of South Korean universities over the past 40 years, Indian universities, Brazilian and others. So I think the distribution of research resources and scientific resources has fundamentally been altered, which opens the way for broader.
We have a connection problem.
So
from California, it is.
So, okay, perhaps we will come back to Henry. Daniela, you wanted to say something, and then I will also put forward the question in the chat if you would like. Okay, so Daniela, if you want to, but you have to open your micro.
I always appreciate Harry's optimism, you know. Indeed, we know that in some cases universities have managed to redirect their choices, but I think that and as usual, there are important differences across universities. But while there is a general consensus to think that the Bail-Dole Act was a good thing in many things, I think that COVID-19 would perhaps suggest that the Bail-Dole Act, as David Aldrich reminded us yesterday, quickly diffused across quite a lot of different countries, was not perhaps the best way to facilitate technology transfer. And perhaps we need to get a better activity of the public sector in order to be able to transmit knowledge to final users, or in this case, to the manufacturing sector, better than so far we have been able to do.
Okay, thank you, Daniele. Perhaps we could give the floor to Theodore. Are you here, Theodore? Because you have two questions, I think. Theodore Leiber?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm here, but I cannot start my video.
Okay.
Since the host stopped it, maybe in a while it comes, so I'm without picture. It was one comment very quickly about Sputnik, which is not a deep comment, but the method is the Russian government or whoever it was managed to produce Sputnik could be questions, because the quality of Sputnik is a bit in question, I would say, in the recent weeks or so. But the question I had was, yeah, maybe it's a bit far away now again, but my idea was if I take the concept of responsible university, so to say, seriously, that means there should be criteria that the university should fulfill for being responsible, as we had some examples, for example, in environmental issues and so on. So my question was, if any of you have an idea or suggestion, which type of organizational or procedural capabilities or specific measures would be needed for universities to implement in order to deal with, in the sense of responsible innovation. So is there any suggestion to put this on the organizational procedural level? This, in addition to what we said about the values necessary and I mean the values that should be shared, of course, by the members of the university. This is already going a bit into details, but what about organizational units or capacities? Do you have any suggestion about this? No, I'm here.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Well, it's difficult. I have no answer to your strategic question, but I can give an answer not so much at the level of the university, but of the whole system. And I think that in Germany, you have the advantage of having several important institutions that are correctly positioned between fundamental, basic research and applied research. And for instance, in France, for years, we would like to have something like the Fraunhofer system, because it's certainly a very good link. It's maybe a missing link in France between the university with their typical roles and the firm. So the answer is not only the organization of the university, but also the organization of the whole system. So this is my just a very small part of response.
Yes, and how do we change the system? By policies, by financing, by...
I mean, that's true. I do not know in such detail the French system, but I know a bit the German one. And it's correct what you said, that we have the Fraunhofer, we have the Max Planck, but we also have additional centers, for example, of innovation. For example, in Baden-Württemberg, they are financed by the state,
Baden-Württemberg, in Northern Westphalia, there are, for example, the Johannes Rau Institute or the Innovation Alliance, it's called in Baden-Württemberg. This is not, I mean, not solving everything, but it's concrete activities, including financing of outsourced, or so to say, industrial firms, which are on campus or nearby campus, and which are situated organizationally between universities, universities of applied sciences, and industry and production. And you can do your PhD there, for example, with a guy from the University of Tübingen, and at the same time do, say, small scale say production lines and applied research in direct contact with University of Applied Science and industry in the region. So these are examples. Of course, you need the correct values then to have the responsible thing packed in there, but these are organizational things outside the university. Of course, my question was about the inside of the university. What could they do, or are they overwhelmed or over responsibility if we put all these things onto them? Question.
So, thank you. If I may add something, so you gave another answer implicitly. It's not only the micro level of the organization of the establishment university, and not necessarily the big overall organization. It's also a medium level, which is the site. So what's fantastic in some places of Germany, I don't say everywhere in Germany, at least in Baden-Württemberg, so you have sites, or in Bavaria, you have sites where you have very close one to another, a big research institute like a Max Planck, a regular university, some applied science universities, Hochschulen, and also some platforms for technology transfer and so on. And all that works at the level of a local ecosystem, and it works very well together. So we also have some places like that in France, of course. They are generated just by chance. It's not necessarily a national policy. It's just self-organization of certain territories, but this is certainly a part of the answer to the question.
So Henri is here now, so you can finish your answer, please.
You want me to continue on?
Yes, because we was. You was cut. The connection was bad.
Okay. Well, I think I made my basic point is that, which I think I just heard Theodore Lieber, that universities have the ability to collaborate with each other, with businesses, with governments. That's basically the triple helix model that appears irrespective of policy or not. This is what is happening, and it can happen on a broader scale. These regional collaborations can be collaborations across world regions. And we have some of that in existence, but it's hidden. I know from studying research group in chemistry at Stanford, they have a partner group at a university in China. The Chinese university group has much more advanced and modern equipment than the Stanford one. The Stanford one is working largely with old laser equipment from 40 years ago. It's an old research group, but it's still the world leading one. The Chinese rely on their colleagues at Stanford to help them get their equipment to work. But in any case, the other issue of equipment is that the costs of equipment in many areas of research are reducing, and the equipment for biotechnology research is much more widespread and less expensive than it was some decades ago. And so I see these things moving basically in a positive direction of the ability to do advanced research, spreading to more centers around the world, and the ability to collaborate. And this is things that we see happening and that can be built upon through policy measures to extend them. This is basically how things have worked in the US. Experiments, for example, in the 1830s, developing agricultural chemistry, the founding of the University of Connecticut, the 1862 law, which established the land grant universities across the country, the application of this model to industry with the foundation of MIT. So these experiments on the ground then spread by policy. These are things we can build upon. And in the case of vaccines, one of the key players was a small German biotech company that came out of advanced university research that was part of a cluster initiative in Germany that was funded by the government. And without that, there would be no Pfizer initiative.
Yes, and Henry, you talked about your concept is a triple helix concept, but you also put forward the role of social movements, etc. So Dimitri, I had a question for you, and then there is another one that I will tell you after. The first one is, what do you think about fourth helix, fifth helix model, etc.? There are now many helixes, and you remain on the three triple helix concept. So how do you feel with the movement of several helix? I would say.
Well, I think they are confusing the situation because they are bringing in non-human actors and treating them as humans. And that's a fundamental confusion, which is introduced by the actor network theory from France, I have to say, my good colleagues and friends, Bruno Latour and others. It's introduced great confusions by expecting non-human actors. Now, maybe it will be that we'll have artificial humans soon, but then they will meet the criteria of humans and we'll have to treat them as such, as are done in some recent plays. So I see triple helix twins, university, industry, and government triple helix for innovation, university, public, government triple helix for sustainability. There are many triple helices.
Okay.
There's the German triple helix of labor, government, and industry. They're all over the place.
Okay.
But it helps to get down to the core actors. There are many supplementary ones that can always be found, but you'll find it happens empirically. We have found historically that this model appears and then can be built upon. So find the triple helix for the particular situation.
Great, thank you. And also, I would like to give the floor to Olivier Sandre, who has many questions. So I prefer to give him the floor. It will be easier. Olivier, please.
Oh, that's nice of you. I listened with great interest. I just said I'm from Bordeaux, and I think here we have this kind of American spirit to have the startup companies around the campus. So we don't have them in the campus, so we keep our academic freedom, but we like to discuss with them as often as possible. I had industrial friends in my office yesterday, and I think it's a good, healthy mechanism. Okay. But they don't tell me what I should study in my lab.
Daniele would like to answer you, I think.
Well, Olivier, that's a very good question. I mean, we have got examples like those in several campuses. For example, the Italian National Research Council has some centers which are often close to Italian industrial districts. And this has been very effective. Now, the real problem is that this is often dominated by what companies manage to understand. As usual, in social, economic, or science and technology policies, it works much better when you are already into the business, while to force the business is very difficult. As you said, a company cannot knock at your door and tell you what you do. This is not effective. You cannot go to a company and to say, you know, I want you to implement my idea, because the company won't do it. And therefore, you know, it's very difficult to do that. But the cases in which the things manage to integrate is particularly successful. And I think within universities, we need to find some better incentives to scholars to work for industry. And therefore, I think that in many cases, university professors should also be, you know, assessed also for the outreach of their activities. And in fields such as chemistry, physics, electronics, software, pharmaceuticals, and quite a lot of other fields, also to see how they manage to interact with companies.
Thank you, Daniele. I agree with you.
So Dimitri says he has connection problems. That's why we cannot see him right now. But well, you can continue to talk with the chat, Dimitri, if you want. Perhaps someone would like to say a last word, because time flies and we are now nearly at the end of this conference. But I would like to let the floor to anyone who would like.
Mm-hmm.
No?
No,
we are
tired.
We are all very tired. Okay, so but I think it was really really interesting final roundtable. Even if we don't have clear answers to all the questions, but it's also research to have more questions at the end that in the beginning. So it's very good for the next steps. And what will be the next steps? We will send you messages, because all the important discourse you had this evening would be important to write and to send us for publication. We have planned several publications in the journals of Research Network of Innovation, which are Innovation en français, and also Journal of Innovation, Economics and Management in English. And also we have a series of books, etc. So we are going to send emails to give deadlines, etc., and to give some instructions for papers, for writing the papers. But please, we will be very pleased to receive your papers and to continue the debate through reading, through publishing, etc. Publishing good science, we are sure of that. So thank you very much to everyone. Sophia, perhaps you would like to say something more?
No, no more.
No?
Only, okay, no, thank you.
So thank you well, it's a bit strange to finish this 3 days of non-stop conference, only some few hours to sleep and no time to eat, etc. So it is a strange experience, but very good one. So thank you very much to all the participants and all the ones who are still here this evening. And it will be there will be another conference next year, and hopefully you will join us. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, goodbye.
Thank you very much. Many thanks, Blandine, Sophia, and Dimitri.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.